Bob Ferguson is big mad. I think we're grating on him a little bit. I think we're getting on his nerves a little bit. But here's the thing. This is a guy who has been training his entire adult life and working toward the governor's office. He's finally running for governor. I think in 2 days he makes his exploratory campaign official. And we will absolutely point out all the reasons why he is not fit to be the next governor of our state. I don't care how long you've dreamed of being governor. I don't care how many political rungs you've climbed along the way. There are things that he has done in the way he operates that I believe make him bad for the state. I think he's a continuation of Jay Inslee, and so I'm not going to be shy on my opinion of it. We need a break. We need a break from that brand of politics. We don't need a whole overhaul in the state. We need a course correction. And that course correction is not going to come from Bob Ferguson. So on the show last week, I talked about Bob Ferguson sending a letter to Merrick Garland about the fentanyl crisis. And he wanted three cities in Washington state, I believe it was Everett, Spokane, and Yakima, to be part of this federal task force operation to interrupt the fentanyl crisis, which I agreed with the sentiments in the letter. Washington state has the worst fentanyl crisis in the country. I agree that those three cities in particular are prime targets for the drug cartel. I agree with all of it. What I take issue with is he has not done a single thing, in my opinion, qualify it that way, to make the fentanyl crisis better. In fact, his silence on key issues related to public safety have directly allowed for the fentanyl crisis to get worse. One of them I noted is the fact that he's filed, 90 now lawsuits against the Trump administration, bragged about all of them, bragged about his record, and a lot of them had to do with issues around immigration and border security. Here's a clip from my segment last week. When Trump was in office, how many times did we hear Bob Ferguson talk about all the times he'd sued the Trump administration? How many of those lawsuits had to do with issues related to the southern border and to immigration that had nothing at all to do with making the southern border more secure so drugs weren't trafficked up to Washington state, that had to do with holding the Mexican drug cartel accountable so that drugs didn't come to Washington state? None of them. He had lawsuits pertaining to border wall funding, trying to stop border wall funding. He had lawsuits pertaining to family separation, adding a question about immigration to the census. He had travel ban 1, 2, and 3 lawsuits. He sued over DACA. Bob Ferguson levied a number of lawsuits against the Trump administration that had to do with his feelings about how Trump was treating immigrants. All right, so Attorney General Bob Ferguson's office saw that segment. They didn't particularly like it, I think it's fair to say. So they've issued me a 3-point email with some corrections that they'd like. So let's review, shall we? And look, I like Brianna. I'm his spokesperson. I've known her for a long time, going back to my mainstream media days. So she's sending me an email, and I'll take a look at it. I've gotten things wrong before. I'm not opposed to correcting issues. So she says, "Good morning, Brandi. Just returned from leave. Caught your show from last week. I'd like to request a correction on a few items. Number 1, you said that we filed a lawsuit to, quote, stop border wall funding. That is correct. I did do that." She says that is not accurate. 16 states sued over border wall funding. In fact, Attorney General Ferguson was one of the few Democratic attorney generals that did not join that lawsuit. She goes on to say, "We did, however, file a successful lawsuit challenging a specific $89 million that Republicans and Democrats in Congress lawfully appropriated for the Bangor submarine base at Naval Base Kitsap. A bipartisan group of more than 100 former members of Congress filed a brief in support of our challenge, along with the U.S. House of Representatives and 60 former National Security and State Department officials who served presidents on both parties. The federal judge agreed with us and agreed that the Trump administration's attempt to sweep money away from Washington state was illegal. That lawsuit was bipartisan and advanced Washington's economic interests, national security interests, and the rule of law. We're requesting that you clarify with your audience." So this is a matter of semantics, really, and actually I'll point you to the press release that Attorney General Bob Ferguson's office put out. I think it was in 2019 when they filed this lawsuit. The headline, "AG Ferguson sues to block Trump from diverting billions for the border wall." So the lawsuit and the basis for it was this $89 million that was allocated to the base at Naval Base Kitsap. However, what Trump wanted to take the money for was to help with construction of a border wall. So yes, by suing to stop him, they did actually take money away from Trump that he wanted to use for border wall funding. So I think that's an issue of semantics. However, that's fine. Offering the context is always good. So that is the context of that lawsuit. Let's see. How about the second and third points in her email? Let's see if we have any corrections that are owed. Number 2. You said that our lawsuits over DACA and the census were over Bob Ferguson's, quote, feelings. Yes, I did say that. She said, like all our work, these lawsuits were about the law and protecting Washington from harm. In both cases, the United States Supreme Court ruled that the Trump administration's actions were unlawful and harmed the state of Washington and its residents. That's fine. It is my opinion, however, that these were about Bob Ferguson's feelings and his political ambitions. I do host an opinion show, and it is my right to have an opinion on the matter. And I think that he was driven in all of these many lawsuits by his political ambitions, his negative feelings about Donald Trump, and his feelings that Donald Trump was treating immigrants unfairly. I also noted that I would probably feel fine about all of those lawsuits if Attorney General Bob Ferguson had also actively been pursuing lawsuits that could have improved security on the southern border. Sue the drug cartel, if you can figure out a lawsuit around that. I mean, there are other lawsuits that could have helped with public safety issues. There are other instances where he could have spoken out about public safety issues, and he did not. Point number 3, you said Bob Ferguson hasn't done a thing about the fentanyl crisis. That's correct. I did say that. This is not accurate. Our office has recovered $1.1 billion that must be used to address the fentanyl epidemic. We took 3 Fortune 15 companies to trial. We rejected a national settlement in order to get better deals for Washington, leading to more than $150 million more than we would have received had we accepted those national agreements. Those resources are going to every community in the state. They can be used to hire first responders, educate youth, and improve treatment options. Those resources will save lives. We are requesting a correction. So I did say Bob Ferguson hasn't done a dang thing about the fentanyl crisis, and I actually believe that the lawsuits they're referencing have to do with the opioid crisis, which led to a heroin crisis, which is a different crisis than the fentanyl crisis that we're dealing with right now. The opioid companies were loose with prescriptions on pills, and then they tightened that back in, and then people got addicted to heroin, and that was the crux of the lawsuits that Attorney General Bob Ferguson was filing. If she disagrees with that, I've told her in an email that you're free to come back to me and say that that's not true. So we're talking about different drug crises. I mean, I think they're all part of the overall drug crisis that we're dealing with. But when I said that Bob Ferguson hadn't done a dang thing to deal with the fentanyl crisis, I mean that he has not, and in context of the conversation, I was focused on his lack of care and concern for the public safety implications. And as I pointed out in that segment, as I reiterated to her in my response email, Bob Ferguson didn't say anything when the state Supreme Court overturned the state's felony drug possession statute. He didn't use an ounce of his political will to push state lawmakers to come up with a solution. So we had a law on the books that made drug possession and drug use a crime. He didn't say anything when in 2021, his party watered down our state's police pursuit statute to the point where multiple law enforcement agencies, both local, state, and federal, said that that would hinder their ability to interrupt drug traffickers. He didn't say jack about it. He also didn't say jack, even as the state's chief law enforcement officer, about the defunding debate and the defunding movement. He kept his mouth shut. What happened? As a result of that, as a result of the toxic political environment that it created, officers left their jobs in our state at record levels. We continue to have the lowest number of police officers per capita of any state in the nation. That means we have fewer police officers to go out to do proactive patrols, proactive policing when it comes to capturing, disrupting people who are pushing drugs on vulnerable individuals in our community. Bob Ferguson had every chance in the world to prove during his time as Attorney General that he cares about public safety and that he does not want his own party to be watering down laws that help us battle the drug crisis that we're currently in. He didn't do any of those things. And so in my mind, he hasn't done jack to make the fentanyl crisis better. He can hide behind his many lawsuits all he wants, but his lawsuits are one-sided and he uses them to gain political points for his run for governor. And it is our job on this show, and I would argue it's the job of every other media outlet to point that out, to point out the utter hypocrisy, like the hypocrisy we pointed out about Bob Ferguson pushing since 2017 to ban so-called semi-automatic assault weapons of war, yet he said nothing when those exact weapons were being handed out of the trunk of a car during the autonomous protest zone in Seattle in 2020, and people patrolled for weeks 6 square blocks of Seattle using the very guns that he's used every ounce of political will he has to ban. So this is a guy who only says and does what he can later spin into political points for himself. And I'm not going to correct a dang thing that I said about any of that.